In my head, this is going to be like a ContraPoints video, but it's definitely not going to be as articulate or as artistic. Right. Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're doing well. If you follow me on my Instagram, you would have seen that the other day I had somewhat of a vent on my stories after reading that Caitlyn Jenner was interviewed by TMZ, and in this interview she stated that she opposed trans women and trans girls in sport. Given the media attention this topic has received over the last 8 months or so, and the record-breaking amount of anti-trans bills and bans that have been passed this year alone, this is kind of a big topic of discussion right now, not only in the US, but all over the world. The reason I was so angry was not only because Caitlyn Jenner is a trans woman herself, having experienced the hardships that we go through in order to just be happy and feel like ourselves, but she was also an Olympic gold medal winning decathlete before she transitioned. And I guess I just kind of expected her to have a certain level of understanding and empathy towards trans people in sport, and would want the same, level of opportunity and kind of equal rights for us in something that she was once so passionate about. But no, the interview being coupled with, as I said, the sheer amount of anti-trans bills and bans that have been passed in the US alone this year, and the worst of the pack, quite frankly, being the disgusting transgender ban in Florida permitting schools to require genital inspections of children, has just kind of done it for me. So in this video, I just wanted to talk about transgender people in sport, what the issues are, if these are actually true, and just why the current state of legislations and attitudes is kind of dangerous towards trans people. So just for a bit of context, identifying as transgender is when a person's sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. Transgender people can transition socially and medically to help relieve the dysphoria that comes with their identity, to help them feel more aligned with their sense of self and in their body, and it quite frankly saves lives. One aspect of medically transitioning is hormone replacement therapy. Hormone therapy for transgender or gender variant individuals, also known as cross-sex hormone therapy or HRT, is a form of hormone therapy in which sex hormones and other hormonal medications are administered for the purpose of closely aligning one's gender expression with one's gender identity. So for example, I identify as a boy, I apply testosterone in the form of a gel, and I look and sound like this, and it makes me feel happier in my body and in myself because it allows me to align physically how I look and how I sound with how I identify as. It works the same way for transgender women. They apply estrogen, and similarly for non-binary identities, they kind of have the choice if they want to present more masculine or feminine, they can use HRT as well. And of course, on top of that, there's also gender realigning surgeries. So with that being explained, here's why there's an issue. So there have been questions and concerns about whether transgender people should be allowed to compete in accordance with their gender identity, specifically trans women and trans feminine identities having an unfair advantage over their cisgender competitors. So testosterone regulates many different functions in the body, including the maintenance of bone and muscle mass. It's argued that athletes who transition to women after puberty will have a greater muscle to fat ratio compared to cisgender female athletes. This debate is being had across the board in many different sports, including rugby, cycling, weightlifting, tennis, and running. This conversation has been going on for decades. In 1975, transgender female athlete Renee Richards was banned from the US Open after refusing to have her sex chromosomes tested, and a lawsuit followed on the basis that her civil rights had been violated. The judge agreed on the case that the testing proposed was grossly unfair. Hannah Mountsie, an Australian women's handball player, was banned from being nominated for the Women's Australian Rules draft because of the disparity in her size to her cisgender opponents in 2017. Similarly, Veronica Ivy, who used to go by Rachel McKinnon, had a victory in the 35 to 44-year-old cycling category at the UCI Masters Track World Championship in October 2018, which was called unfair, and competitors called for the cycling international body's rules to be changed. And most recently, World Rugby, the global governing body for rugby union, decided to bar trans women from playing in the international women's game on the grounds that it is unsafe. The argument basically is that if you were born biologically male, no matter what your testosterone levels are currently, your physiology has been permanently changed, and therefore it makes it unfair on cisgender females, and so you should compete in the male category. While I can understand where this logic is coming from behind these ideas and statements, it's ultimately transphobic and anti-trans. The issues and the decisions that have been made around this have resulted in a range of rather negative and exclusionary outcomes. Whether this is attempting to strip trans women of their wins, create hostile and invasive testing systems, or banning them from playing altogether, the outcomes have not been positive for transgender people in sport. So naturally, the next question that follows is it true? Despite Trump's best efforts to ban all transgender topics of discussion during his 4-year reign of terror, other countries have been able to look into this and to see if the claims of unfairness are true. While the sample size is not huge due to the fact that transgender identities are a minority, there have been some scientific investigations and papers written up that have come back with some answers. In 2017, a paper from Loughborough University was published which did a systematic review of 8 research articles and 31 sport policies to determine whether there was a real cause for concern of an athletic advantage. The conclusion of the report was as follows. Currently, there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgender female individuals or male individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition, and therefore competitive sport policies that place restrictions on transgender people need to be considered and potentially revised. The International Olympic Committee has allowed transgender women to compete in women's events since 2004. It loosened its rules in 2015, removing the requirement for genital surgery in favour of a declaration of good faith and requiring, in the interest of fair competition, that trans women reduce the amount of testosterone in their blood for at least a year before competing. However, it is important to note that there are studies that suggest a biological advantage can remain even after a year of hormone therapy. A September 2019 study from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm found that a year of hormone therapy decreased muscle mass in transgender women only modestly. The British Journal of Sports Medicine has proposed that these 12-month treatments for trans women supported by World Athletics and the International Olympics Committee are not sufficient due to trans women still being 12% faster than biological women after 2 years of treatment. Last year, a scientific literature review titled Transgender Women in the Female Category of Sport: Perspectives on Testosterone Suppression and Performance Advantage revisited the issue. The paper came to the conclusion that strength, lean body mass, muscle size, and bone density are only trivially affected after the reduction of testosterone levels in trans women, and there is a varying advantage depending on which sport is being played. However, further into the conclusion, it is stated that the research conducted so far has studied untrained transgender women, and so it's still uncertain how transgender women athletes would respond. As you can see, there seems to be some mixed results. It isn't as clear-cut as a lot of policies and anti-trans narratives would let us believe. Both the 2017 Lundberg study and the 2020 literature review brought up the point that the amount of quantitative research, particularly on trans athletes, is limited, meaning that the policies that have been brought out so far have been mostly based on fear rather than scientific evidence. So with the scientific evidence having been explained, where does that leave us? While there is some evidence that non-athletic transgender women retain the majority of their strength, muscle size, and bone density, there is no evidence for this unfairness and the advantage it brings. As I said earlier, the Olympics has allowed transgender females to compete since 2014. When I started writing this video, there had not been a single transgender female athlete to qualify for the Olympics. However, the other day, on May 5th, 2021, news articles broadcasted that Laurel Hubbard, a transgender female weightlifter from New Zealand, was almost certain to qualify for a place in the delayed Tokyo Olympics this summer. This makes her the first ever transgender athlete to compete at an Olympics. So if the Olympics have allowed transgender athletes to compete for the last 15 years, and it is only now that we're seeing the first ever transgender competitor, where is this unfair advantage? California passed a law in 2013 that allowed trans youth to compete on the team that matches their gender identity. There have been no issues reported. U Sports, Canada's equivalent to the US's National Collegiate Athletic Association, has allowed transgender athletes to compete with the team that matches their identity for the past 2 years, and again, there's been no reported backlash. In February last year, the families of 3 cisgender girls filed a federal lawsuit against the Connecticut Association of Schools, the non-profit Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference, and several other boards of education in the state. They were upset that transgender girls were competing against the cisgender girls in the high school track league. Their argument that the transgender girls had an unfair advantage and should be forced to play on the boys' teams. In describing the case in the Wall Street Journal, opinion writer Abigail Schreier stated that when transgender girls compete on trans sport teams, cisgender girls can't win. Schreier failed to include in her opinion piece that 2 days later, after the Connecticut lawsuit had been filed, one of the cisgender girls beat one of the transgender girls named in the lawsuit in a Connecticut state championship. Jack Turbin for the Scientific American summed it up kind of perfectly. There is no epidemic of transgender girls dominating female sports. Attempts to force transgender girls to play on the boys' teams are unconscionable attacks on already marginalized transgender children, and they don't address a real problem. They're unscientific, and they would cause serious mental health damage to both cisgender and transgender youth. That lawsuit was then later dismissed of April this year. Transgender athletes have been stepping onto the podiums, winning titles and medals, and being reported in the media headlines. But the point is that they're not winning everything. These sporting performances are a prime example of what humans, specifically athletes, can accomplish with hard work, effort, and dedication that they put into their passion. Instead, they're being put down to unfair biological advantage. Turbin's article goes on to point out that this isn't the first time people have tried to discredit the success of athletes from marginalized minorities based on half-baked claims of science. There's a long history of similarly painting black athletes as genetically superior in an attempt to downplay the effects of their hard work and training. It's also important to mention that transgender women are not the only women with high testosterone levels. An estimated 10% of women have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which results in an elevated testosterone level. Other common causes of high testosterone levels in women are hirsutism and congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Science. Caster Semenya, who was born an intersex cisgender female, has faced many issues in her successful career as a multiple world champion and Olympic gold medalist runner between 2009 and 2016 as a result of her high testosterone levels. Katrina Karkazis, an expert on testosterone and bioethics at Yale University, explains, studies of testosterone levels in athletes do not show any clear or consistent relationship between testosterone and athletic performance. Sometimes testosterone is associated with better performance, but other studies show weak links or no links, and yet others show testosterone is associated with worse performance. Ultimately, there is not enough scientific evidence on transgender athletes, but the evidence we do have from both past and current sporting policies, looking at sporting history with the presence of transgender athletes and the final scores, there is no correlation between transgender athletes and this unfair advantage. If policies are to be made, they need to be made without an anti-trans rhetoric shaping what it stands for. They should be made and supported with evidence and without the aim to attack a minority's rights. This can be seen in the bills that have already been passed in the US. This goes for more than just sports policies too. Bans on participation in same-gender youth sports, bans on gender-affirming healthcare for minors, curriculum bans, ID restriction, and other legislations. The fear-mongering that goes hand in hand with legislations being made about and for transgender populations is dangerous and ultimately transphobic. GLAAD reported that 80% of Americans do not know a transgender person personally, and so all they know or understand of the transgender minority comes from the media. And for the majority of the time, the media talks about transgender people rather than to transgender people. It is truly important to talk to the transgender people and to listen to them and their narratives to quickly realise the falsities that have been spread, which is a prime example of what's happened here. Again, I want to go back to Jack Turbin's article as I believe it finishes on the perfect point. Legislators need to work on the issues that truly impact young people and women's sports. Lower pay to female athletes, less media coverage for women's sports and cultural environments that lead to high dropout rates for diverse athletes, instead of manufacturing problems and solutions that hurt the kids we are supposed to be protecting. So that was my kind of mini essay / presentation about transgender people in sports. I hope you found it informative and maybe enjoyed it a little bit. I will link below in the description all the links of the articles and resources and papers that I read. I understand that this is an ongoing discussion, but in this I just wanted to kind of show that it's not as cut and dry as articles might make it seem, and that I feel like there's no evidence to what's being said about the transgender population. So I just wanted to do a bit of digging and present that to you guys. So yeah, please do give it a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and if you want me to do something similar with other topical things going on in the world. Thank you guys, and I'll see you all soon.